So now let's create our video processing service, specifically just the boilerplate in this video. We're not actually going to write any processing code. So I'm going to open up the terminal and I'm going to make a directory. I'm going to call it video processing service. It's a little bit cut off, so hopefully it's still readable. We created that directory and now I'm going to run ls and you can see that the directory does exist. Now, I think it should be showing up on the left-hand side here. So this is probably a bug. I'm just going to reopen VS Code. And there you go. Now it does show up. Live demos are always the best. Now I'm going to cd into that directory and we're going to initialize an npm project, a node project. We're going to do that with npm init. So I'm going to run that, but you could also run it with the Y flag and that would auto accept all of the prompts that it's going to give us. But I'm going to run it like this just to show you each of the prompts. It tells us what is the package name. Yeah, that name is fine. So I'm going to say yes. The version is fine. Or I guess in that case, we don't have to put a Y. We can just press enter and accept the default with a description. I'm not going to add any description for now. Our entry point is going to be index.js and the test command, we're just going to use the default, get repo default, and pretty much just accepting the defaults for all of these. And once again, accepting the default. So now that we have run that command, let's see what it actually did. Let's open up the directory on the left-hand side and we can see that there is a package JSON. There's nothing exciting going on. There's basically just some metadata information. I guess for name, I put Y, so that's what it's going to be here. I'll change it to video processing service. No big deal. And to make it match, let's just actually make it match the directory structure. So most of this is just the default setup, but a package JSON is important in Node projects. It basically tells us all of the dependencies, how we're going to run and build our source code, and just metadata and information like the name, description, and stuff like that. Now we're going to reopen the terminal and actually install some dependencies. And I'm going to clear the terminal. The framework that we're going to be using here is going to be Express. So I'm going to run npm install Express. So that's going to install this dependency only for this project. And that's what a package JSON defines, a specific node project. So now I'm going to run this command and what you're going to see is here that there's going to be a dependency added. So scrolling down, you can see dependencies. Now we have a dependency. It's Express. This is the version. We're going to use this to write our code in just a second, but I'm going to add a couple more dependencies. In this case, I'm installing a couple dev dependencies. So I'm going to pass in this flag save dev. And we're going to install two dependencies at the same time. Actually, we're going to start with TypeScript because this project is not going to be vanilla.js. We're going to be using TypeScript. And I'm also going to be passing in TS Node, which is kind of a helper that's going to make development a tiny bit easier for us. So now here you can see that we have a couple dev dependencies. The difference between regular dependencies and dev dependencies is that these dependencies are only needed while we're actually developing our code. But when we build and deploy the code, these dependencies will not be included in the final build. And that makes sense because TypeScript is really only a development tool. It provides static typing for us as we code up our project, but it doesn't provide like runtime static typing or anything like that. And now a couple more dependencies. And by the way, a shorthand for npm install is actually npm I, if you didn't know that. So I'm going to be using that. I'm also going to install a couple more dev dependencies, and these are actually going to be the type definitions that our TypeScript code can actually use. So we're going to be installing the types for the Node.js runtime and the types for the Express framework. This basically allows us to mix those libraries, those vanilla.js libraries, with TypeScript. And it looks like I had a typo, which is pretty good because you might have the same issue. So let's see what's the command that we ran. And we need to do types/node, not just type. So rerunning that, and now you can see it does work. And I once again reopened VS Code because it's being kind of weird right now so that we can actually see the new files that were created. There's a package lock file. I won't go super in depth into that, but it's an expected file that's going to be created as you install dependencies. And it's also something that you are going to commit to your version control system. Here we can see node modules. This is something you're not going to commit to your version control. So we don't want to add this when we make a git commit. What we can do here is create a file in this directory called a .gitignore, and then we can specify here that node modules is not something we want. So before I save this, you can see here on our source control, we have 949 modified files. We definitely don't want to commit these. Now that we've added this and I go ahead and save the file, you're going to see that this gets updated. And yep, so now going back to source control, you can see that the only modified files are our package files and our git ignore. So that's good. Now we can start writing some source code. And the first thing I'm going to do is reopen the terminal, go back to the video processing service and create a file, which is the TypeScript config. This basically tells us how exactly we want to use TypeScript and how we want to build our code. Now I'm going to open that file that we just created. And instead of typing this out, it's not something you're probably going to memorize by heart. So what I would recommend doing is referring to the documentation. If you Google TypeScript config, you'll probably get to this page. And this kind of tells you the basics about TypeScript config. And this is one way that we could specify the configurations. But here you can see that we would have to specify each individual TypeScript file that we want to be used in the build. And there's actually a slightly better way to do it. Scrolling right below that, we can pass in a path like this and just say everything in the source directory is going to be included in our build. Now, I'm not going to use exactly this configuration. I'm going to use a slightly different one. So let me show that to you. I'm just going to copy and paste this, but I'll explain every line. So target basically tells us which version of JavaScript we're using. When you hover over it, you can kind of see that. And for node projects, typically we want the common JS module. Our root directory is going to be source. And that's because here, when we actually start writing our code, I'm going to put it all within a source directory. So let me actually just create that directory now. It's going to be called source. Cool. We got that. The output directory is going to be dist. That's kind of the default. That's usually what it is. So basically when we build our code, our final build files are going to be within that directory. Strict is the configuration for type checking. Generally, strict is better. This is also a good default option to have, and I won't go super in depth into it. But here is a bit more relevant. Include basically says that we want to include here all TypeScript files within the source directory, and we want to exclude all node modules files. I'm pretty sure this is done by default, but it's not bad to like manually specify it here. It makes it clear. Since this is an array, we could pass in other files. Like if we had test files, we probably wouldn't want to include those as well. Now let's head back to our package JSON and define a couple of scripts. Here you can see the only one defined right now is test. And the way we would run that is by opening our terminal, being within the video processing directory so that we kind of have access to the package JSON, and then run npm run test. And what you'll see is it just echoes a string like that. Now we don't have any tests, and that's not what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be focusing on 3 commands starting. This is what's going to be used for local development. You can see GitHub Copilot already knows what we're going to write. Basically, tsnode is a package we installed locally. It allows us to run TypeScript code without compiling it to JavaScript. So this is going to be useful just for local development so that we don't have to compile it every single time we run the code. When we actually want to build and deploy our code, we are going to call npm run build TSC. This is TypeScript compiling our source files into the final JavaScript files that we can actually deploy. And when we want to actually deploy them, this time Copilot didn't know what we wanted. We're going to run serve, and then we would just run node on the JavaScript files that are built and put into the dist directory. Remember, dist is the directory that the final files are going to go to. That was specified here. So that kind of explains what we're doing here. We're not going to be focusing on these 2 commands really. Locally, we're just going to be calling npm start. These are going to be saved for deployment. Now, finally, to actually write some source code, we're going to create a new file in the source directory, index.ts, just like we specified here. That's going to be like the entry point for our project. And it's pretty much going to be like one of the only files we have, to be honest, at least for now, because we can create our local Express server. Remember, Express is the package we installed. If I tab complete here, we get that, but that's not exactly what I was going for. We're just going to import Express like this, and we're going to initialize it by calling const app, creating an instance of it. And the port that we're going to be using, I think the default for Express apps is just port 3000. And for now, I'm just going to create a very, very simple route with app.get. And the route is going to be the root route. We could specify a path like this, like maybe upload a video. But for now, we're not going to do that. We're just going to have a root path. And every endpoint typically has a request and a response. Now we can specify the functionality like this in our brackets. So this is like an anonymous function in TypeScript, and that function is what we're passing into here. That's going to be executed every time this endpoint is called. It's a get endpoint, an HTTP get endpoint. That's worth noting. And we're just going to return a very, very simple response, response.send a string like hello world. Now that we've defined our endpoint, we probably also want to actually start our server at some point. So we're going to say app.listen on this port and execute this code. And in our case, it's pretty good to have some like logging. So we can specify like which port we're actually running on. So we'll say video processing service listening at localhost on this port. And this line is a bit long, so let me kind of move it down so we can see the entire thing. So cool. That's pretty much what we were going for. Now we can run this locally. And don't worry, if you ever forget how to run it locally, that's what package.json is for. If you're ever in a new node project and you don't know how to run it, you can usually go here and we see npm start, npm run start. And you can see we got the output. We know that our log statement executed. So now let's open this up in a browser. So when I do that, we get what we would expect, a string with hello world. Congratulations, you set up a TypeScript Express app. But of course, this is not what we're going for. We are creating a video processing service. So let's do that in the next video.